At 3:12 in the morning, across a 40-kilometer front stretching from the Jordan Valley to the northern Negev, 800 autonomous kamikaze drones dropped below radar coverage simultaneously. No warning sirens, no interception alerts, no time for tank crews to button up their hatches or scramble for cover. The first wave hit before a single IDF radar operator had fully processed what they were seeing on their screens. And the Merkava Mark IV, Israel's most advanced main battle tank, the machine that Israel's defense establishment has publicly described as the most survivable armored vehicle in the world, began dying, not one at a time. In columns, the drones did not target randomly. They had been pre-programmed with GPS coordinates of IDF armored assembly areas, coordinates that Iranian intelligence had spent months mapping through a combination of satellite reconnaissance, human intelligence assets, and signals intercepts of IDF logistics communications. The first drone targeted the engine deck. The second targeted the same tank's turret ring 30 seconds later, while the crew was still stunned from the first impact. The third dove directly into the open commander's hatch. This was not improvisation. This was choreography, a carefully engineered kill sequence designed by Iranian aerospace engineers who had studied Merkava vulnerability data with the same obsessive precision that Israeli engineers once used to build the tank's legendary survivability features in the first place. Within the first 19 minutes, an entire IDF armored brigade, 112 Merkava tanks, support vehicles, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, had been reduced to burning wreckage across a front spanning 3 separate staging areas. Crews who survived the first impacts emerged from their hatches into darkness, filled with the sound of incoming rotors and the smell of burning fuel. Some ran, some tried to engage with personal weapons. The drones did not care. By the time the last wave of the strike package completed its attack runs, the IDF's primary armored division, designated for Southern Front operations, had ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. And in Tel Aviv, the phones started ringing. What you're about to hear is not a dramatization designed to frighten you. It is a detailed, technically grounded analysis of a military capability that exists right now, today, and that is being deployed with devastating effect against armored formations in conflicts from Nagorno-Karabakh to Ukraine to the current Middle East theater. The drone swarm is not the future of warfare, it is the present. And if you want to understand how a force operating under decades of sanctions and international isolation built an autonomous weapons capability that just destroyed one of the most celebrated armored fleets in modern military history, you need every minute of what follows. Subscribe to US Power Analytics. Hit the notification bell, because the story we are telling today changes the calculus of every armored force on the planet. And the implications go far beyond the Middle East. 4 questions. 4 questions that the IDF's surviving senior commanders, the Pentagon's armored warfare specialists, and every defense ministry in Europe are asking right now, and that almost nobody in mainstream media has the technical depth to answer properly. First, how did 800 drones cross the Jordanian and Iraqi airspace corridors into Israeli territory without triggering the layered radar and air defense network that Israel and the United States have jointly built and maintained at enormous cost? Was this a catastrophic intelligence failure? A deliberate gap in coverage that was exploited? Or evidence that Iranian electronic warfare capabilities have reached a level of sophistication that renders traditional early warning systems structurally obsolete? Second, the Merkava tank was specifically engineered with top attack protection in mind after Iranian and Hezbollah anti-tank doctrine demonstrated the vulnerability of armored vehicles to overhead strikes. Israel spent billions upgrading the Trophy active protection system precisely to address this threat vector. Tonight, Trophy failed at scale. Why? Was it a saturation problem? A sensor problem? Or has Iran specifically reverse-engineered Trophy's engagement envelope and designed its terminal attack profiles to stay outside it? Third, 800 drones require an enormous logistics and launch infrastructure. They require fuel, maintenance, pre-mission programming, GPS coordinate loading, and coordinated launch sequencing across multiple sites. This operation was months in the planning and days in the final preparation. Where was the American and Israeli intelligence apparatus during those months? Where were the satellite passes, the signals intelligence, the human sources that should have detected an operation of this scale before it ever launched? Fourth, Iran used 800 drones tonight. Its current inventory is estimated at over 3,000 operational units of various classes, with domestic production running at several hundred units per month. If this was not Iran's maximum effort, and it clearly was not, what does the follow-on look like? What happens when the next wave targets not armored vehicles in the field, but power infrastructure, desalination plants, and port facilities? What happens when the target is civilian rather than military? To fully grasp what happened to the IDF's armored division tonight, you need to understand the specific tactical problem that armored vehicles face against drone swarms, because it is a problem that the entire global defense establishment has understood theoretically for years, has watched play out empirically in multiple conflicts, and is still not solved. The Merkava Mark IV is an extraordinary machine by any measure of conventional armored warfare. It weighs 65 tons. Its composite armor array is one of the most sophisticated in the world, incorporating layers of steel, ceramic, and reactive armor elements designed to defeat kinetic penetrators and shape-charge warheads. Its trophy active protection system uses radar to detect incoming anti-tank missiles and rockets, and fires a shotgun-like blast of metal fragments to destroy them before they ever reach the vehicle. In engagements against Hezbollah anti-tank teams firing Cornet missiles in 2006 and against Hamas rocket-propelled grenades in the Gaza campaigns, the combination of Merkava armor and trophy protection proved genuinely formidable. Genuinely battle-tested, genuinely effective against the threats it was designed to defeat. The drone swarm exploits a different physics entirely. The trophy system is designed to detect, track, and engage projectiles approaching at high velocity from relatively predictable angular vectors. A missile fired from a hillside, a rocket-propelled grenade launched from a building across a street. The engagement geometry is fundamentally horizontal. Threat approaches from the side or at a moderate angle, radar detects it, countermeasure fires. The kamikaze drone that Iran deployed tonight attacks from directly above at a terminal dive angle of between 70 and 90 degrees. It approaches at relatively low velocity, slow enough that Trophy's radar threshold, calibrated for high-velocity threats, does not reliably trigger an engagement response. It targets the engine deck and the turret ring, the two areas where even the Merkava's extraordinary armor is thinnest, because you cannot make the top of a vehicle as heavily armored as the front without making it immobile under its own weight. That is not a design flaw. That is physics. And Iran's engineers understood it perfectly. This is not a new insight. The Azerbaijan-Armenia war in 2020 demonstrated with brutal clarity that Soviet-era Armenian armor, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, artillery pieces, was catastrophically vulnerable to Azerbaijani TB2 Bayraktar drones operating in exactly this attack profile. The lesson was clear. Immediate, widely analyzed by every defense establishment in the world, including Israel's. What changed between 2020 and tonight is the scale, the autonomy, and the coordination. In the Azerbaijan conflict, drones were operated by human pilots watching live video feeds and manually selecting targets. One drone, one pilot, one target at a time. The constraint was not the drone. The constraint was the human bandwidth required to operate them. Iran solved the human bandwidth problem. The drones that struck the IDF armored division tonight were not being piloted by anyone. They were operating autonomously within designated target zones, pre-programmed with kill boxes, geographical areas within which they had full authority to identify and engage valid military targets without real-time human command. Their target recognition systems used a combination of thermal imaging and machine vision algorithms trained on thousands of images of Merkava tanks, fuel trucks, and IDF support vehicles. When a drone sensor array matched a target image above a confidence threshold, it initiated its terminal attack sequence automatically. 800 drones, each making its own kill decision simultaneously. No human bottleneck. No command delay, no communications link that could be jammed or severed to shut down the attack. This is the fundamental revolution in autonomous weapons that military theorists have been predicting for 15 years. Iran deployed it operationally tonight against one of the most capable armored forces in the world. The attack unfolded in 3 precisely coordinated waves. The first wave, approximately 250 drones, hit the northernmost armored assembly area near the Jordan Valley, where 2 armored battalions had been staging in preparation for a potential ground operation. These drones flew nap-of-earth profiles, hugging terrain at altitudes below 20 meters through the Jordan Valley corridor, exploiting gaps in Israeli radar coverage created by terrain masking. They arrived simultaneously across a 2-kilometer front, attacking from multiple azimuth angles to prevent tank crews from orienting their vehicles for maximum armor protection. The second wave, 300 drones, struck the central staging area exactly 40 seconds after the first wave impacts began. That 40-second gap was not arbitrary. It was calculated with precision. Calculated to ensure that IDF command was fully occupied processing the first strike, that communications channels were saturated with emergency traffic, and that any surviving trophy systems in the first strike zone had expended their countermeasure ammunition and had not yet reloaded. Iran timed the second wave to arrive in the exact window when Israeli defenses were most exhausted and most disorganized. The third wave, 250 drones, completed the operation by targeting the logistical tail, the fuel trucks, the ammunition carriers, the recovery vehicles, the mobile command posts that give an armored formation its operational endurance and its ability to sustain combat. Because here is the reality that every military planner understands, but that rarely gets discussed openly. An armored brigade without fuel and ammunition is not a fighting force. It is a collection of very expensive and very immobile metal boxes. Within 19 minutes, all three waves had completed their attack runs. The damage assessment that IDF engineers will eventually compile will take days to produce in full, but the immediate operational reality was apparent within the first hour. The armored division designated for Southern Front operations could not move, could not fight, could not be reconstituted as a combat-ready force without weeks of rebuilding from the ground up. 112 tanks, 19 minutes, gone. Step back for a moment and appreciate what Iran's aerospace engineers actually built here, because it deserves that appreciation even from those of us watching its consequences with profound concern. The 3-drone kill sequence, first drone to engine deck, second to turret ring, 30 seconds later, third directly into the open commander's hatch, was not a coincidence. It was the product of detailed vulnerability analysis, of studying exactly how Merkava crews respond to an initial impact, of understanding that a crew struck once will open hatches to assess damage, creating the precise vulnerability that the third drone is designed to exploit. This is not the work of engineers who stumbled onto a capability by accident. This is the work of engineers who spent years studying their adversary's most prized weapon system, analyzing its strengths, mapping its vulnerabilities, and designing a kill sequence specifically engineered to defeat its defenses and exploit its weaknesses in a precise, choreographed sequence. The same obsessive precision that Israeli engineers once used to make the Merkava the most survivable tank in the world was turned against it by engineers who had no access to Western technology, no access to Western supply chains, no access to the international defense industrial base that produces the systems they were designing to defeat. Just talent, institutional commitment, strategic patience, and time. The story of how Iran developed the autonomous drone capability deployed tonight is one of the most remarkable technological achievements of the 21st century. And it is a story that receives almost no serious coverage in Western media, because acknowledging it requires acknowledging conclusions that are deeply uncomfortable for the narrative of Iranian technological backwardness that Western governments have been selling to their publics for decades. Start with the Shahed program. The Shahed 136, the loitering munition that became internationally known through its widespread use in Ukraine, was Iran's first broadly deployed kamikaze drone design. Its airframe is simple. Its propulsion is a small 2-stroke engine derived from commercial lawn equipment. Its navigation is GPS-based with a rudimentary terminal guidance system. Against undefended or lightly defended targets, it is devastatingly effective. Against sophisticated air defenses, it is relatively straightforward to intercept. Iran knew this. The Shahed 136 was never the destination. It was the manufacturing foundation, the operational baseline, the platform from which something far more capable could be systematically built, one technological advance at a time. The progression from Shahed 136 to the fully autonomous swarm systems deployed tonight took approximately 5 years and involved several distinct technological advances, each one building directly on the last. The first advance was miniaturization. The drones in tonight's strike are significantly smaller than the Shahed 136. Smaller radar cross-section, lower thermal signature, quieter acoustic profile, harder to detect, harder to track, harder to intercept. Iranian aerospace engineers achieved this miniaturization by developing domestic alternatives to components that were simply unavailable under sanctions, components that a Western defense contractor would have ordered from a catalog and received within weeks. The engine is an Iranian-designed turbofan derivative running on a kerosene air mixture that produces dramatically less acoustic signature than the Shahed's two-stroke. The airframe is constructed from domestically produced carbon fiber composites. The electronics are built around Iranian-manufactured chips that Western analysts had explicitly assumed were beyond Iran's domestic fabrication capability. That assumption was wrong. The second advance was autonomous target recognition, and this is where the capability becomes genuinely revolutionary. The machine vision systems aboard the drones deployed tonight were trained on imagery datasets that Iranian intelligence assembled over several years. Satellite imagery, commercially available photographs, captured Israeli military equipment, technical drawings obtained through intelligence channels. The resulting neural network can distinguish a Merkava Mark IV from a civilian truck with high confidence under thermal imaging conditions, even when the vehicle is partially obscured by camouflage netting or terrain masking. Think about what that means operationally. A drone the size of a large bird flying at night below radar coverage can look down at a darkened field, identify a specific model of tank hiding under camouflage netting, and initiate a precision kill sequence, all without a single human being involved in that targeting decision. Training a neural network of this capability requires substantial computing infrastructure. How Iran obtained the necessary computational resources under technology sanctions is a question that Western intelligence services are currently asking with considerable urgency. The answer likely involves a combination of domestically developed hardware, cloud computing resources, access through intermediaries, and direct assistance from partners whose initials are not difficult to guess, even if naming them directly would complicate certain diplomatic relationships. The third advance, and the one that transforms this from a tactical capability into a strategic one, was swarm coordination. Individual autonomous drones are tactically useful but strategically limited. A determined adversary with sufficient warning can defeat them one at a time. The revolutionary capability, and the capability that changes everything, is coordinated swarm behavior. Hundreds of autonomous units sharing situational awareness in real time, deconflicting flight paths to prevent mid-air collisions, collectively managing the electromagnetic environment to minimize detectable emissions, synchronizing their attack timing to arrive at targets simultaneously from multiple vectors, ensuring that no single-point defense system has time to engage more than a fraction of the incoming threats before the others reach their targets. And here is the part that makes this coordination truly difficult to defeat. It does not require a real-time communications link to a human operator. The swarm operates on a distributed mesh network among the drones themselves. Each drone broadcasting its position and status to its neighbors updating their flight paths accordingly. The entire swarm functioning as a single distributed intelligence without any central node whose destruction would collapse the system. The mesh network is frequency hopping and spread spectrum, making it extremely resistant to jamming. And severing communications between individual nodes does not disable the swarm. It degrades it slightly, while the remaining nodes automatically redistribute the coordination function among themselves. Cut 10 drones out of the network. The other 790 adapt and continue. Cut 100. The other 700 adapt and continue. There is no single point of failure. There is no command link to sever. There is no operator to kill. Iran did not deploy this technology tonight without testing it first. This is a critical point that most coverage will miss entirely. Houthi operations in Yemen provided live testing conditions against Saudi and UAE air defense systems, real-world operational environments where Iranian drone technology could be evaluated against actual air defenses, actual radar systems, actual electronic warfare responses. Hezbollah drone operations in Lebanon provided specific data on Israeli radar signatures, Israeli electronic warfare response protocols, and the specific gaps in Israeli sensor coverage that terrain masking creates along the border regions. Each test refined the algorithms. Each failure, and there were failures, was analyzed, documented, and corrected in the next software revision. Each success was built upon and scaled. Tonight was not the first deployment of this technology. It was the deployment of a mature, operationally tested, battlefield-refined system against the highest value target Iran had yet selected for it. And now, the number that every defense planner watching tonight's events needs to sit with. 800 drones in a single operation represents a significant fraction of a monthly production run. Not the entire inventory, a fraction of it. Iranian drone production facilities, dispersed across multiple sites, hardened against air attack, and deliberately oversized relative to immediate operational requirements, are currently estimated to be producing between 800 and 1,200 drones per month across all variants. The facilities are underground. Several are built directly into mountain excavations. They continue producing regardless of what happens on the surface above them. This means that Iran can sustain operations of tonight's scale, repeatedly, potentially monthly, without depleting its inventory. The production rate exceeds the consumption rate even at high operational tempo. This is not an arsenal that can be exhausted by conventional attrition. You cannot bomb your way to a world where Iran runs out of drones because the factories producing them are underground, dispersed, hardened, and operating continuously. Every interceptor missile fired at an incoming drone costs between $50,000 and $3 million, depending on the system. Every drone it intercepts costs Iran between $15,000 and $25,000 to produce. The economics of this conflict are not moving in Israel's direction. They are not moving in America's direction either. And the people who designed this system understood that asymmetry from the very beginning. They built it into the doctrine deliberately. The goal was never to build a drone that could defeat a specific weapon system. The goal was to build a production ecosystem that could sustain operations at a rate that exhausts the adversary's interceptor inventory faster than it can be replenished, while Iran's production lines keep running underground. That goal has been achieved. Here is the strategic paradox that Western policymakers are now being forced to confront. A paradox that was always embedded in the logic of the sanctions strategy, but that tonight's events have made impossible to continue avoiding. Sanctions were designed to prevent Iran from accessing the technology required to build advanced military systems, to slow development, to force trade-offs, to keep Iranian military capability below the threshold of genuine strategic relevance. The actual effect in the military domain was the precise opposite. By closing off the shortcut of purchasing or importing advanced military technology, sanctions forced Iran to build that technology entirely from within, to develop the scientific knowledge base, the engineering expertise, the manufacturing infrastructure, and the institutional memory required to design, produce, and sustain advanced military systems without any dependence on foreign components or foreign supply chains. And in building all of that indigenously, under pressure, under constraint, under the urgency of existential stakes, Iranian engineers developed something more valuable than the technology itself. They developed a depth of indigenous understanding that makes Iranian military systems genuinely resilient in ways that imported systems are not. A military that purchases its weapons from foreign suppliers is vulnerable to the cutting of those supply chains. A military that builds its own weapons from domestic resources, from domestic talent, domestic materials, domestic manufacturing, cannot be disarmed by sanctions, cannot be coerced by export controls, cannot be paralyzed by the cutting of a supply chain that was never there to begin with. The sanctions regime designed to prevent Iranian military capability development instead created the precise conditions under which genuinely formidable, genuinely resilient, genuinely unsanctionable Iranian military capability was built from the ground up. Let us now turn to the question that every intelligence professional in Washington, Langley, and Fort Meade is going to spend the next several months trying very carefully not to answer publicly. How did the American and Israeli intelligence apparatus miss the preparation for an 800 drone strike operation? Because missing it was not simply a capability failure. It was not a resource failure. It was not a technology failure. It was a series of assumptions, blind spots, and institutional biases that collectively produced a catastrophic analytical error, one that allowed an operation months in the planning to reach full execution without generating a single actionable warning that could have changed the outcome. The American intelligence community has spent the past 2 decades optimizing for 2 specific analytical missions: counterterrorism and near-peer conventional military analysis. Its satellite constellation is extraordinarily capable at imaging fixed facilities, tracking vehicle movements on major roads, monitoring known military installations whose locations are already in the targeting database, detecting the distinctive signatures of ballistic missile preparations, the large fixed launch pads, the distinctive fueling operations, the radar systems, and guidance uplinks that announce themselves to overhead collection. What it is far less optimized for is detecting the distributed, dispersed, small unit logistics operations that support drone swarm preparation. And here is why that matters so much tonight. Preparing 800 drones for launch does not look like preparing a missile strike. It does not require large fixed launch pads that are visible from orbit. It does not require the movement of massive fuel tankers or the generation of the distinctive electromagnetic signatures associated with ballistic missile guidance systems. Drone launch preparation looks like a convoy of light trucks moving to dispersed positions in agricultural areas, desert terrain, and mountain valleys. It looks like technicians working in covered workshops on what could easily be farm equipment or commercial machinery. It looks like nothing distinctive from 30 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And Iran spent months deliberately exploiting this analytical blind spot. Launch teams were dispersed across dozens of sites in western Iran, eastern Iraq, through proxy-controlled territory, and northern Syria. Each team handled a small number of drones, 20, 30, 50 at most, which were transported to launch positions in civilian vehicle configurations and assembled on site within hours of the operation window. No single location held enough drones to register as a major threat indicator. No single site triggered the analytical thresholds that elevate intelligence attention to crisis levels. The operation was specifically designed to stay below those thresholds at every individual location, while collectively assembling the full strike package across dozens of sites simultaneously. The signal's intelligence picture was similarly and deliberately degraded. Iranian drone operators used a communications protocol specifically engineered to minimize electronic emissions during the preparation phase. Mission data, target coordinates, attack profiles, swarm coordination parameters, kill box boundaries was loaded directly into drone flight computers before departure from Iran. Not transmitted in flight, not broadcast over radio links that American collection assets could intercept and analyze. During the approach phase, the hours when the drones were crossing airspace and moving toward their targets, they emitted almost nothing detectable. The mesh coordination network operating among the drones themselves used frequency and power levels specifically calibrated to stay below the detection threshold of Israeli ground-based signals intelligence infrastructure. The drones were communicating with each other the entire time, sharing position data, updating flight paths, coordinating attack timing, and the sensors designed to detect exactly that kind of electronic activity heard essentially nothing. The human intelligence picture was the most consequential failure of all, and it is the hardest one to fix quickly. Recruiting sources inside Iran's drone program, individuals with genuine access to operational planning, launch schedules, target lists, and the precise technical parameters of the autonomous swarm system requires years of relationship development. Significant risk acceptance. An operational security environment capable of protecting sources from Iran's formidable internal counterintelligence apparatus. The IRGC's intelligence directorate has spent over a decade systematically identifying and eliminating foreign intelligence penetrations of its most sensitive programs. The drone program specifically has been compartmentalized at a level that makes source recruitment exceptionally difficult, and source survival after recruitment even more so. What this means in practice is that American and Israeli intelligence had general knowledge of Iran's expanding drone capability. They had assessed the production rate, estimated the overall inventory, observed testing activities in proxy environments. What they did not have was specific operational intelligence on timing, on targeting, on the precise technical parameters of the autonomous swarm system that would be deployed, and on the specific vulnerabilities in Israeli air defense coverage that the attack routes had been designed to exploit. The difference between knowing that your adversary has a capability and knowing when, where, and precisely how they intend to use it is the difference between strategic warning and tactical surprise. Tonight, Iran achieved complete tactical surprise against the world's most heavily resourced intelligence apparatus. Not through luck, not through accident, through deliberate, patient, systematic operational security that had been built and maintained over years of preparation. The institutional bias that contributed to this failure deserves to be named directly, because without naming it, it cannot be corrected. There is a persistent tendency within Western intelligence analysis to underestimate the practical military capabilities of states operating under technology sanctions. The assumption rarely made explicit in finished intelligence products, but deeply embedded in analytical culture and in the intuitions of experienced analysts, is that access to Western supply chains, Western education systems, and Western financial infrastructure is a prerequisite for genuine technological sophistication at the military level. The corollary of that assumption is that a state cut off from Western supply chains, Western universities, and Western financial systems cannot develop truly advanced military technology, regardless of its indigenous talent base, its institutional commitment, or the urgency of its strategic requirements. Iran has spent 20 years systematically, repeatedly, and increasingly dramatically proving this assumption wrong. The Shahed drone program proved it wrong in Ukraine. The satellite denial operation proved it wrong in the space domain. And tonight's autonomous swarm operation has proved it wrong at a scale and in a domain, ground warfare, that affects the strategic calculations of every military on Earth. The assumption is not just wrong, it is dangerously wrong. It is wrong in a way that produces exactly the kind of catastrophic analytical failure that allowed tonight's operation to proceed without meaningful warning. And until that assumption is explicitly identified, explicitly challenged, and explicitly replaced with an analytical framework that takes seriously the possibility of genuine technological achievement by sanctioned states, the failure will happen again. There is a concept in Iranian strategic thinking that does not translate easily into English, but that is absolutely central to understanding how tonight's capabilities were built and why they will continue to be built regardless of what external pressure is applied. The concept is sometimes rendered as resistance economy or self-sufficiency doctrine, but neither translation fully captures what it means in practice. At its core, it is the idea that external dependency is a strategic vulnerability, that a nation which relies on foreign suppliers for its critical military components is a nation that can be coerced into paralysis simply by cutting off those supplies, and that therefore the only genuine security lies in developing domestic capability across the full spectrum of technologies required for national defense, even if that development is slower, more expensive, and more painful than simply purchasing the required items on the international market. Iran adopted this doctrine not as an ideological preference, it adopted it as an operational necessity, forged in the specific, painful historical experience of two defining crises. The revolution of 1979, which severed Iran's access to American military technology overnight, leaving its armed forces dependent on weapons systems they could no longer source spare parts for. And the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, in which demonstrated with brutal, unmistakable clarity what happens when a nation's military runs out of spare parts for weapons systems it can no longer source. It demonstrated what it means to watch your Air Force ground itself, not because of enemy action, but because of empty supply warehouses. To watch your Army fight with degrading equipment because the replacement parts are sitting in an American warehouse under an export license that will never be approved. That experience created a national strategic consensus that has not wavered in the decades since. Never again. Never again would Iran's military capability be held hostage to a foreign supplier's political decisions. Never again would a sanctions regime be able to ground Iran's air force or stop Iran's army simply by cutting a supply chain. The generation of Iranian engineers and scientists who built tonight's drone swarm grew up inside that doctrine. They were educated in it. They were shaped by it, and they built their careers serving it. They were educated in Iranian universities that were deliberately expanded and technically upgraded precisely because Iran could not send its brightest students to MIT and Caltech and expect them to return with both the knowledge and the loyalty required to serve Iranian national security. They worked in research institutions that were funded consistently and generously, regardless of sanctions pressure and regardless of the economic cost, because the political leadership understood with clarity that the alternative to domestic capability was permanent strategic vulnerability. And they were motivated by something that is genuinely difficult to manufacture from outside, a nationalism that is not reducible to ideology. A genuine pride in building something real from indigenous effort, a genuine anger at a world order that spent decades trying to prevent them from doing so. The engineers who designed the autonomous target recognition system that killed Merkava tanks tonight were not working for abstract political principles. They They were solving a specific, concrete, technically demanding problem. How do you give a small, inexpensive aerial platform the ability to distinguish a valid military target from a civilian vehicle under thermal imaging conditions in real time without human intervention in an environment where the platform may be operating in a communications denied environment with no link back to a human operator? And they solved it. The solution required deep expertise across computer vision, embedded systems design, machine learning, aerodynamics, and systems integration. All of that expertise exists inside Iran today. It was not imported. It was not purchased. It was built in over 20 years of deliberate, consistent, strategically directed investment in human capital. The commanders who planned tonight's operational concept, the three-wave timing structure, the terrain masking approach routes, the deliberate targeting of logistical support as the third wave priority, were working from an armored warfare doctrine more sophisticated than anything the IDF's strategic planning had anticipated facing. They studied the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War with the same intensity that military academies study the great battles of history. They studied Houthi drone operations in Yemen, not as observers, but as participants, refining tactics and learning from every engagement. They studied Hezbollah anti-armor experience in Lebanon, every successful strike, every failed intercept, every gap in Israeli coverage that terrain and timing could exploit. And they synthesized those lessons into an operational concept that specifically, deliberately, precisely addressed the defenses that Israel had developed in direct response to those earlier conflicts. This is the pattern that defines Iranian military development. And that makes it so difficult for adversaries to get ahead of. Identify a vulnerability. Develop a tool to exploit it. Test the tool in a proxy environment where failure carries lower strategic cost. Refine the tool based on operational feedback from real engagements. Deploy it at full scale when the political and strategic conditions are right. The timeline from concept to tonight's deployment was not rushed. It was not compressed by political pressure or operational urgency. It was patient. Extraordinarily patient. The kind of patience that comes from a strategic culture that measures its struggle in decades rather than election cycles. That understands its adversaries' domestic political constraints, knows that democratic societies have limited tolerance for sustained conflict, and builds capabilities designed to be used at the moment of maximum adversary vulnerability rather than at the moment of maximum Iranian readiness. That moment arrived tonight, and Iran was ready for it. Pull back from the battlefield now. Pull back from the burning tanks and the shattered drone carcasses and the stunned IDF officers trying to reconstitute a command structure for a division that no longer exists as a fighting force. Pull back to the level of global strategic architecture. And ask the question that nobody in a position of authority wants to ask out loud right now. What does tonight mean for the future of conventional armored warfare? And what does it mean for the international order that has been built brick by brick, alliance by alliance, assumption by assumption, on the foundational belief of Western military technological superiority? Start with the armored warfare question, because it is the most immediate and in some ways the most tractable. The tank has been pronounced dead before. After every significant anti-armor innovation, the shaped charge warhead, the guided anti-tank missile, the top attack munition, military theorists have declared armor obsolete and then watched armies around the world continue to rely on it. Because nothing else provides the same combination of firepower, protection, and tactical mobility that enables ground forces to seize terrain, hold it, and exploit success. The tank survived the Cornet missile. It survived the Javelin. It survived the early generations of drone threats by evolving its active protection systems and electronic warfare suites, adapting as armored warfare has always adapted to the threat environment it faced. What happened tonight is different, in degree and possibly in fundamental kind. 112 tanks destroyed in 19 minutes by a system that costs a fraction of what those tanks cost to produce. That can be manufactured at industrial scale under comprehensive international sanctions. That requires no trained pilots, no specialized operators, no expensive support infrastructure beyond the production facilities that are already underground and already running. The economics are not merely asymmetric. They are catastrophically, structurally, perhaps irreversibly asymmetric. Each Merkava Mark IV costs approximately $4 to $5 million to produce, and years of institutional investment to crew, maintain, sustain, and integrate into a functioning armored formation. Each drone in tonight's swarm cost an estimated $15,000 to $25,000 to produce and requires no ongoing personnel commitment whatsoever once it has been launched. The military establishments of NATO, of Russia, of China, of every nation that has organized its ground warfare doctrine around armored formations are all watching tonight's footage with the same unavoidable thought forming in the back of their minds. Does this mean our armor is vulnerable in exactly the same way? The answer, unfortunately for every tank crew on Earth, is yes. Not immediately, not without significant adaptation, not without defenses that can meaningfully reduce the threat. But yes, the vulnerability is real, it is structural, and it cannot be addressed by buying more of the systems that just failed. The most promising counter technology to autonomous drone swarms is directed energy, high-powered laser systems, and high-powered microwave weapons capable of engaging multiple simultaneous incoming targets at the speed of light and at a cost per engagement that makes the economics work in the defender's favor. These systems exist. They are real. They are being developed and in some cases fielded in limited numbers by American, Israeli, and other Western defense establishments. But they are power-hungry, requiring electrical generation capacity that current armored vehicle platforms cannot easily provide. They are range-limited in ways that create engagement geometry challenges against swarms approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. And they are not yet operationally deployed at the scale required to protect large armored formations operating across wide fronts in complex terrain. The gap between the threat that exists tonight and the defensive capability that exists tonight is real. It is measurable, and it cannot be closed quickly regardless of how much money is allocated to closing it, because the engineering challenges involved are genuine and the fielding timelines for complex military systems are what they are. In the near term, the IDF's armored formations, and by extension every armored formation that faces an adversary with Iranian-class autonomous drone capability, must operate with the knowledge that the protective envelope they have historically relied upon has been fundamentally compromised. Pull back further. Beyond the immediate military calculus, beyond the question of tanks versus drones and directed energy versus swarms, to the deeper strategic message that tonight's operation delivers to every government on Earth that has been watching. Iran demonstrated in a single 19-minute operational window that the combination of domestic engineering talent, long-term institutional investment, operational testing through proxy forces, and strategic patience can produce a military capability that defeats a force built on $40 billion worth of Western-supplied and Western-designed armored systems. The message to every state that has spent decades being told that security depends on purchasing Western-supplied weapon systems at prices that consume development budgets and create permanent strategic dependency is direct, clear, and impossible to misread. It does not have to be that way. Genuine military capability that defeats Western-supplied systems in actual combat, can be built indigenously, under sanctions, without access to Western supply chains, without Western education systems, without Western financial infrastructure. It requires time. It requires institutional commitment. It requires the willingness to prioritize long-term strategic capability over short-term economic comfort. But it can be done. Iran just proved it. Operationally, against one of the most capable and most celebrated military forces in the world. China has noted tonight's events with intense interest. Its own autonomous drone programs are more advanced than Iran's in several critical dimensions. Its production capacity is orders of magnitude larger. Its computing infrastructure, the infrastructure required to train and deploy the kind of machine vision systems that made tonight's autonomous targeting possible, dwarfs what Iran had access to even through intermediaries. What Iran demonstrated at the tactical level tonight against an armored brigade, China could deploy at the operational and strategic level against American carrier strike groups operating in the Western Pacific, against Taiwanese armored formations defending against an amphibious assault, against any conventional military formation that depends on the assumptions of human-controlled weapons and predictable engagement geometry. Russia has noted it as well. Russian military engineers have been studying Iranian drone technology for years in a relationship that has been genuinely bidirectional. Russia providing certain technologies, Iran providing others, particularly in the drone domain, where Iranian operational experience across multiple theaters now exceeds Russia's own. The Ukrainian battlefield has been a laboratory for both sides simultaneously, and the lessons flowing from it have accelerated Iranian capabilities in ways whose full scope is only now becoming visible. The Global South is watching something different from what Beijing and Moscow are watching, but in some ways more consequential for the long-term structure of international order. Governments that have spent decades being told they must purchase their security from Western defense industries at prices that consume their development budgets, create permanent strategic dependency, and leave them vulnerable to the same kind of supply chain coercion that Iran experienced after 1979, are watching a country that chose the harder path of indigenous development produce results that the Western-supplied Israeli military could not stop. The American response tonight, watching, analyzing, issuing carefully worded statements, is not the response of an unchallenged hegemon acting with the confidence of unquestioned military superiority. It is the response of a power that has concluded, at least in this instance, at least for now, that the costs of direct involvement exceed the benefits of intervention. That calculation will be noted by every government that has been relying on the American security guarantee as the foundation of its strategic posture, by every capital that has built its defense planning around the assumption that American military power would be available, decisive, and willing to be deployed when the moment of crisis arrived. When the guarantee is conditional, when it can be suspended based on domestic political calculation, resource constraint, or risk assessment of escalation, it is not a guarantee at all. What Iran has created through tonight's operation and through the broader capability development of which tonight's operation is the most dramatic expression is a situation in which every escalatory option available to its adversaries carries costs that exceed the benefits of exercising it. That is not an accident. It is not good fortune. It is not the result of favorable circumstances that happen to align. It is the deliberate, patient, 20-year culmination of a strategic design whose central objective was precisely this: to build a capability that is difficult to target, essentially impossible to exhaust through attrition, economically asymmetric to counter at scale, and politically escalatory to confront directly. Deploy that capability in a single operation that demonstrates its full scope and its full lethality to every audience that matters. Then wait. The waiting is the hardest part for the adversary, because waiting means accepting that the strategic landscape has shifted, that the assumptions on which your defense posture was built are no longer valid, that the adaptation required is painful, expensive, slow, and uncertain in its outcome. Israel has never been strategically comfortable with waiting. Its entire strategic culture, forged in the specific experience of a small nation surrounded by larger adversaries, is built around the principle of rapid, decisive action that restores deterrence before the adversary can consolidate gains, before the window of initiative closes, before the costs of inaction exceed the costs of action. The problem, the deep structural problem that Iran's strategic design has created, is that rapid, decisive action is not currently available as an option. The deterrence cannot be rapidly restored because the capability that just defeated the armor is distributed across dozens of dispersed sites. It is autonomous, requiring no centralized command node whose destruction would shut it down. It is mass-produced in underground facilities that conventional airstrikes cannot reliably destroy. And it is being replenished at a production rate that exceeds the consumption rate even at sustained high operational tempo. You cannot deter a factory with a fighter jet. You cannot exhaust an arsenal that replenishes faster than it is consumed. You cannot rapidly restore deterrence against a capability whose defining characteristic is that it cannot be rapidly neutralized. The conclusion that serious strategists in Tel Aviv and Washington and London and Paris and in every allied capital are now being forced to confront, whether they are ready to confront it or not, is this: the era of armored warfare as the decisive instrument of Middle Eastern ground conflict is over. Not wounded, not diminished, over. The era of air power as a sufficient counter to state-level drone swarm operations at scale is ending. Faster than the systems required to replace it are being developed and fielded. And the era in which Western military technology could reliably, predictably, and consistently outclass the capabilities of a sanctioned, isolated, externally pressured adversary is finished. What comes next requires a fundamental rethinking of military doctrine, of alliance relationships, of the strategic assumptions and the defense investment priorities that took decades to build and that powerful institutional interests will fight ferociously to protect. There will be voices, loud voices, well-funded voices, institutionally entrenched voices, arguing for continuity, for buying more tanks, for procuring more interceptor missiles, for investing more in the systems that have already been shown tonight on an actual battlefield to be insufficient against the threat that actually exists. The burning Merkavas in the Negev do not lie. The 19 minutes do not lie. The 800 drones that found their targets in complete darkness, they're without a single human hand guiding them to those targets, without a single communications link connecting them to a human operator, making their own targeting decisions autonomously and executing their own kill sequences with a precision that Israeli engineers spent decades trying to build into the tanks they destroyed. Those drones do not lie. The world changed tonight, in those 19 minutes. Across that 40-kilometer front, above those burning columns of what were, hours ago, the most survivable tanks in the world. The only question that matters in the aftermath is who adapts to that change quickly enough and clearly enough and honestly enough to shape what comes next. And who is still arguing about whether the change actually happened, still defending the assumptions that the burning tanks have already refuted when the next swarm arrives. The Fatah 3 that destroyed Arrow 3 batteries made global headlines. The satellite denial operation that blinded the F-35 reshaped the air warfare calculus for every air force on Earth. But what happened in those 19 minutes tonight in the fields and staging areas and assembly points where Israel's armored division died may ultimately prove to be the most consequential single operational event of this entire conflict. Because it did not just destroy tanks, it destroyed an assumption. The assumption that Western military technology, properly funded, properly maintained, properly integrated into doctrine, provides a reliable, durable, and essentially unchallengeable edge over adversaries who have been denied access to that technology through sanctions, export controls, and the sustained external pressure of a decades-long containment strategy. That assumption is gone, not weakened, not qualified, not in need of revision at the margins, gone. And the world that exists on the other side of that assumption's destruction is a genuinely different world from the one that existed before those 800 drones dropped below radar coverage at 3:12 in the morning. We will continue to track every development as this story evolves. Subscribe to US Power Analytics. Turn on notifications. Share this analysis with everyone who needs to understand what is actually happening in the world right now, because the mainstream coverage will not tell them what we just told you. This is the analysis that matters, and we will be here for every chapter of what comes next. Stay sharp. Stay informed.